Hey y'all, it's Mr. Clemens. So today we're going to cover a very interesting time in history, and that is the Cold War conflict and its relation to Cuba. So not a whole lot of people know that after World War II, even though that there really wasn't a fight globally, there was a fight globally. So two superpower countries, which the definition in itself is one of very few dominant states in an era where the world is divided ideologically and politically into satellite states or just states in general. So an example of this is the Soviet Union and the United States. So these two countries actually were the two that were involved in this global conflict. What came to be about of one of these reasons why these two countries fought was they got into what we call a arms race. So an arms race is when two or more countries compete to see who can create the most and the best weaponry. This also led to what we call a space race. So around the 60s and 70s, the idea of putting a man or machine into space became something that a lot of countries tried to do. The two countries that ended up coming out on top of this race were the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union launched the satellite Sputnik, and the US responded with the Apollo missions and so on and so forth. This worldly conflict ended up being what we call the Cold War. So the Cold War is when two global powers get in a state of tension and there's no fighting. Or in this case, the United States and the Soviet Union got in a standoff. It just so happened that these two countries had the most advanced and most powerful nuclear technology available. So the way that Cuba comes into place is that Cuba and the Soviet Union shared ideologies, which were communism. Communism was what they had in common. So communism is an economic system where the community and government own the business. So the government was in charge of the commerce. Government was how the Soviet Union and Cuba made money. So naturally, because they were the same in their ideals, they shared military bases. And this was the case in Cuba. The Soviet Union, during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War conflict, decided to place missiles into a port in Cuba, and that just so happened to be 100 miles off the US coast, which put everything into an alarm. Now the US, part of the reason why the US was in such hostile relations with Cuba was they were different in their ideals. The US was very much capitalist, which means that capitalism is an economic system which is based on the private ownership of business. So the people control the business. It's not the government. The government has no say in it. The only time the government has a say in it is when people don't pay their taxes or people don't do right by their business practices. And another way that the United States was different than the Soviet Union was that they were a democracy. So a democracy is a political system where the people elect the government and the people get to control what kind of policies that the lawmakers bring into the government. And this is what's going to kind of set the Soviet Union and the United States on a clash, especially whenever people from both sides want to do what we call defecting. So defecting is when you want to trade alliances, militarily, politically, citizen-wise. What will bring about is espionage, so spying. So a lot of spies will defect in order to either gain information for their country, or they'll defect out of fear of like their livelihood or so on and so forth. So just to kind of wrap this up, the 8 terms that we discussed here connect to this global idea about how if you aren't able to find common ground when your ideals in the world, it's going to lead to conflict with other countries. So one thing that I would like for you to do for homework is I would like for you to give an ID. So an ID is who, what, when, where, and why. So this will give you a better understanding of these 8 topics that we covered today. So I want for you to bring that, do one of these terms, and I'll give you a check mark for the lesson. If you have any questions, you have my email, but in case that you forgot it, here it is. Again, I want the one ID in class tomorrow. Thank y'all.